this is my community, this is my home. And that's something that I think is really, really beautiful and really wonderful that they've set up the community in this way where it's not viewed as transitional housing. It's not supposed to be a stepping stone to help people get back on their feet and get into some other quote unquote normal living situation. Like this is the community that people want to be in and want to stay in.
Hello, and welcome to Shared Space, a podcast about the power of architecture and design to make us healthier, happier, and more connected. I'm your host, Erin Peavy, and I'm so glad that you're here with us. Today, I'm really excited to be talking with design architect, impassioned activist, and Austin-based Design for Equity leader, Shelby Blessing. She'll be sharing with us stories from Community First Village in Austin, a 51-acre master plan community that provides affordable, permanent housing and supportive community for men, women coming out of chronic homelessness. This is an inspiring example for anyone that hasn't heard of it, and there's so much to learn, and I just really can't wait to dive in. Thank you so much for joining us, Shelby.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. So I just wanted to start with, what is your earliest memory of even being aware that architecture or design exists as a field and how it kind of impacts you?
Yeah, great question. I think I'll skip the normal Lego example. I think a lot of architects cover. Wow. And I think one of the first times I remember really thinking about it as a profession was I think I was in seventh grade and we were having this medieval fair at our school, and each person had to choose what their medieval profession would be,
Oh my
and take on that role at the fair. And there was this other girl who I thought was really cool who chose to be an architect so that she could design a medieval castle as her project for the medieval fair. And I was like, well, that sounds great. That's a fun project. So I became a medieval castle architect in seventh grade, and I think it sort of planted the seed in my head that that was a profession that I could choose. And I think the more I thought about it later on, I realized it combined a lot of different interests that I had. I was really interested in art, but really good at math, and kind of liked the interdisciplinary nature of architecture and the fact that it requires a lot of really different and sometimes conflicting skill sets.
Yes, yes. Oh, that's awesome. Oh my God. I just see the cute little Shelby Blessing, seventh grader, being like, can you tell us about some of the origins of the Community First Village project and how you first got involved?
Yeah, so I first got involved with Community First Village back in 2014 through a design competition that AIA Austin put on called Tiny Victories. So, Community First Village is a master plan community east of Austin that houses formerly chronically homeless individuals. And it was started by a nonprofit here in Austin called Mobile Loaves Fishes that has been working with the homeless population in Austin for over 2 decades. And they, for a long time, had really focused on taking food out to people on the streets. And they have these food trucks that drive around the city, and they still do this. They have a lot of volunteers who go out on truck runs and they take food and deliver it to people on the streets who are in need. And over the years, Alan Graham, who's the founder of Community First Village, I think he really saw that they were treating the symptoms of homelessness, but they weren't necessarily
Mm.
addressing the root causes or helping change the system. And so they really started, they had built a lot of relationships with people in that process. And they started sort of on an individual level, working with a few of the homeless folks that they had met and helping them get into, I think at the time it was mostly in RV parks or trailer homes, and trying to get them off the street and housed, just kind of ad hoc, one-on-one, working with individual people.
Mhm.
And that was great kind of on an individual level at the start. But the thing that they were seeing was when they did that, they were pulling someone out of the community that they had built on the street and the social support network that they had, and putting them in a community where suddenly they didn't know anybody, they didn't have any relationships or resources, and a lot of times that didn't last. And so
Yeah.
really their vision for Community First Village was to do that on a much bigger scale, where they could actually build that community and that support network at the village. Design wise, it started from that same concept too, where they said, okay, we're going to build an RV park on steroids, which was kind of the model that they had been working in. But as they got a little further along, they realized that there was a real value to actually bringing in architects and designers and asking us to help them design homes that would feel special and feel permanent and really create a special place and a home. I think the RVs were useful in a lot of ways because they provided for a lot of needs, but they have the drawback of appearing very transitional because they've got wheels and they look like they could drive away anytime. And so they've really adapted their model over the years to focus a lot more on, creating a permanent community, creating a space that's special and where the residents who move in feel like they can stay there as long as they want and that it's not temporary or transitional.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, can you kind of paint a picture for us of what this looks like?
Sure. So at Community First Filch, it's honestly hard to describe, and even in a photo, it's hard to get a sense of it. I really recommend anyone who's anywhere near Austin, Texas, just go take a tour, see it for yourself because it's a
Yeah.
totally different experience in person. So the village is kind of about half of it started with the RV park, and so it's a mix of RV homes, but over the years they've started to switch to park model RVs and more permanent models that have built-on porches and everything. And then the other side is all tiny homes. So it's a whole village of about 150 tiny homes in phase one. And there's also a second phase that's been constructed since. Sure, we'll talk more about that. But the tiny home area includes this hugely eclectic variety of different home designs. And
Yeah.
five of those home designs that are repeated many times in phase one of the village all came out of the AIA design competition. There are a variety of other ones as well, some from the architects who'd been working on the site plan, some from different architecture firms who approached and said they wanted to help and contribute a home. And a lot of them did the design and, raised money for the materials and helped build it. And
Wow.
then there are also a mix in the phase one of some tents that they call canvas sided cottages that are like kind of a
Mhm.
large double layered tent, and some
Mhm.
that were these ones called easy logs that were kind of a Lincoln Logs kit of parts that volunteers could put together easily, which is something they experimented with early on and have since moved on from. So it's
Yeah.
this kind of wild mix of different choices. And one of the really great things is that when somebody moves into Community First Village, they get to tour several different houses and pick the one that
Yeah.
meets their needs. And so the variety is really useful
Yes.
because everybody's different. Everybody has different priorities and goals for their home. And so that choice
Yeah.
is offered to residents immediately when they move in, that they get to choose the house that either speaks to their personal style or where they want to be located on site or how much storage or how public or private they want their house to be. All of those
Mhm.
choices are available, and it's for people coming out of homelessness, they often haven't gotten to make many choices while they're homeless.
Yes.
They're often being pushed from place to place. They're told they're not allowed to be somewhere, and their choices are very limited. And so I think that's something that's really amazing is that just the design of the village offers that choice right away.
Right? I feel like there's so many like there's just a countless number of things that make what you guys are doing so unique, and I feel like one of the critical parts of kind of, human dignity is the ability to choose what you want,
Mhm.
who you are, and be able to have your place to honor and dignify your own needs for that, part of your life. One of the things that I have loved is how you guys talk about healthy communities and how this is a core component of what you're thinking about, and I think of course choice is a key piece of that. Like, what are some of the other pieces both in the community overall, but also like thinking about in the tiny victories, what was leading some of you guys core design principles and considerations? Can you sort of paint that picture for us?
Yeah, when I first got involved, I didn't really know any of that. I saw a call for designs from AIA, And I had a coworker who actually, a coworker saw it first and approached me and said, "Hey, here's this design competition. It sounds really cool. Do you want to be on a team?" And so we put together a team, and and really we were working with pretty limited information, which was the design
Yeah.
brief that we got for the competition that said, okay, you're designing a micro home for one individual, someone who's experienced chronic homelessness. It should be under 200 square feet, have no kitchen or bathroom because those are in shared facilities on site. So it's really just the kind of
Hmm.
bedroom and living space for one person. And originally, we were designing them to not have any plumbing or air conditioning either, which
Hmm.
is something that has evolved over time too. I think everyone's realized maybe in Texas we should all have air conditioning, or a tiny house might not be able to fully engage the passive strategies we would need if we didn't want air conditioning. Um,
Yeah.
so we started with that design brief, and it was something that my team designing had a lot of discussions about because none of us had experienced homelessness. We're designing for
Hmm.
a somewhat generic, abstract client who we haven't gotten to talk to and don't have that personal experience ourselves. And so we had a lot of conversations about what did that mean, what would be a good home for somebody. And for our team, we really came down on the idea of choice that we've already talked about making sure
Hmm.
that the house provided the basic needs, but also making sure that the house left some options and some flexibility so that somebody could come in with their own ideas and interests and
Yeah.
continue to evolve the house to meet their needs. But I think in many ways the key considerations for what makes a good home for someone who's experienced homelessness, it's not any different from what makes a good home for you or I. It's a place
Yeah.
where you have comfort, you have security, you have the ability to lock the door if you want and decide who gets to come in and out of your space. It's a place for all your
Hmm.
belongings and to sort of express who you are and your interests. And so one of the things that I think really influenced our team during that process was that because we were in Austin, we got to come and do a site tour and hear
Hmm.
from Alan Graham, the founder of Community First Village, about his goals for the homes. And one of the things he shared were these 8 characteristics of home that came from a book called Beyond Homelessness, where it really outlined, some of those intangible aspects of, permanence, personal
Yeah.
expression, um, belonging and identity, all of these things that a house does for us that's a lot more than just
Hmm.
a roof over your head and a shelter from the weather. And so that was
Yeah.
every team that was in Austin that was entering the competition had that in mind. And non coincidentally, I think in a national blind juried competition, all of the winning designs that were selected ended up being teams from Austin. I don't think that's because Austin is just better designers than everyone. I think it's because we got an extra piece of information that wasn't in the design brief that really encouraged us to think beyond
Yeah.
just shelter and really think about how do you make a house a home.
Nice. Oh, that's wonderful. So, if you just pluck somebody out, that they're losing that social connection, they're losing that support network. How have you seen the design of Community First, and also, the programming and how it's embodied each day? Like, how have you seen that focusing around human connection and the creation of community?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that are kind of baked into the design of the homes and the design of the site that are really there to encourage connection and community. So
Hmm.
one is that the tiny houses were all required to have a front porch. And really with that idea that, part of what makes a great community or a great neighborhood is neighbors sitting out on their porches, talking to people as they walk by and sort of building that web of relationships in a neighborhood. And
Hmm.
so that was in the original design brief, was that every house, there
Yeah.
was a limit on square footage, but every house was required to have a front porch that faced the main pedestrian pathways that go through the neighborhood
Hmm.
to really encourage those connections. And that was something that my team took to the extreme. We actually broke the rule on how much porch area we were allowed to have and made a super huge porch because we felt like that was a really big priority, was to create that space that could be more than just sitting out with a chair, but actually a space for hosting or for,
Yes.
a job or a hobby or other activities. So that's
Yes.
one thing. And then I mentioned that the houses don't have kitchens or bathrooms. So in the tiny home area of the community, everyone has shared outdoor kitchen facilities where they can cook and
Mhm.
eat and share meals together. And so I think that really helps to encourage connection in those neighborhoods. A lot of those connections take place over food and over shared meals. And so the
Yes.
fact that a lot of that cooking is happening together helps to encourage that. Same with the
Yeah.
bathrooms to some degree, I think less so, but you can imagine if you're going there brushing your teeth
Yeah.
every morning, you run into the same people over and over again. And it's sort of those, informal acquaintances that build into
Yeah.
friendships and relationships over time that helps to support.
But that's super cool. So 2 questions. One is what are the communal spaces like? And number 2 is, you had mentioned little kind of neighborhoods, and I'm wondering how many people or homes make up those neighborhoods?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think in phase one, the definition of neighborhoods came a bit after the fact. And so, but
Mhm.
I think it's kind of defined by street or they don't have roads going to all the tiny homes. It's more pedestrian pathways that go there. But all of the homes that are kind of on each of the same pathways have house numbers that start with the same number. So the way that they talk about it in the
Mhm.
community is somebody will say, "Oh, I live in the 600s or I live in the 700s," based on the address of their
Yeah.
home. And everybody who lives in the 600s actually has a shared council member that's on their community council. So they have their own kind of local, very hyper local government
I
that
love
has a
that.
community council member for each of those little mini neighborhoods that represents the residents in their area and helps to make decisions for the community. So that's one thing. It is something that I've been part of some evolving conversations with Community First Village about planning for their future growth, and it's something that in the future they're looking to be a lot more intentional about really defining the scale of a neighborhood and thinking about, as they look at scaling up the community they have and or starting some additional communities to help serve more people. As they scale, suddenly the ability to be a community really changes. In the past, when they only had 300
Mhm.
people total living there, they were about reaching the limit of how many people could all know one another. And so it's more and more
Yeah.
important as they grow to really, really lean on the unit of the neighborhood to be the place where those relationships are formed first within a larger community.
Mhm.
And so we did a lot of work with them, kind of thinking around how that works in their community, how that works in other communities.
Quick question, is there space for families, or is this basically meant for single residents? Like, what's like sort of the range of what you guys see?
Yeah, so for most of the residents who are formerly homeless, the micro homes are all for one individual. There
Mhm.
are some who have either come in couples or developed couples since they've moved in. And so for those, they usually end up moving into one of the RVs, which has a little more space to
Mm.
accommodate, or keeping two tiny houses. And I think there's a range of couples on site who've made different choices around that. And then there are some families as well. About 10% of the folks who live at Community First Village have never experienced homelessness and are instead choosing
Mm.
to live at Community First Village to kind of be in service to their neighbors, and kind
Mhm.
of be there to help support the community. And that includes a lot of families with young children. And so that's something that um, I think the village design so far partially accommodates those, but it's something that as they're looking to the future, one of the things they are talking about for future phases is to figure out how they can actually better accommodate families, and if they need a housing type they don't have yet, that would make it even easier for those families. In order to qualify to live at Community First Village, they have to be chronically homelessness, which is defined by either repeat experiences of homelessness or duration
Mhm.
of homelessness. And they
Mhm.
also have to have two qualifying disabilities, which includes a
Mm.
range of sort of physical, mental, and substance abuse issues. And
Mhm.
and so the community that Community First Village is serving is among like the most
Yeah.
vulnerable chronically homeless population. And that's
Mhm.
actually typically not families. There is also an
Yeah.
issue with family homelessness, but that's not the community that Community First Village
Yeah.
primarily serves. And it's
Yeah.
something that they acknowledge. There are other organizations that are better equipped to serve those families experiencing homelessness. And right now, that's not
Yeah.
them. And so their focus has been on individuals experiencing chronic homelessness, a lot of whom are older, um, are struggling with a wide variety of issues that,
Yeah.
disability issues or medical issues, things like that. And so that's the community that they've really focused on.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think it's important to know your niche and be able to serve them well, which it, very clearly sounds like that's happening. I was wondering, what are some of the lessons learned that you would say both apply to as Community First Village grows, but also other similar types of villages in the future?
I was part of this original design competition, not really knowing much about Community First Village when I got started with that. Through that, ended up the design that my team did was one of five that got selected to be built in phase one. So I ended up working a lot with the builders, coming out on site, volunteering with some of the teams that were
Mhm.
that were out there to help build the houses, and then also got involved with AIA Design Voice, which is the committee at AIA Austin that had put on the competition. So I decided I wanted to learn more about them, get more involved, and help continue that relationship of their work with Community First Village. And so in the process, I ended up, a year or so after phase one had started construction and people had moved in and all of that, I was walking around the site with a staff member and hearing just really amazing anecdotal evidence about hearing from her about when they gave residents the choice of which home to move into, which homes
Mhm.
tended to get chosen first and why. And
Oh,
I was like very very fascinated with this because
yeah.
as architects we don't often have the opportunity to go back and evaluate our designs, and every time we do a design
Yeah.
we're making a hypothesis about what the best solution to the problem is, but we don't always go back to see the results of the experiment and see if our hypothesis was correct or not. And so this was a
Yeah.
really interesting microcosm opportunity to do that, not just with projects where, the time from design through construction to occupation happened really quickly, but also we had a lot of
Mhm.
different architects all on the same site trying to solve the same problem in different ways. And so
Yeah.
I, with AIA Design Voice, helped initiate a post occupancy study to go back and interview residents from phase one.
Mhm.
And we
Mhm.
interviewed 20 different residents, and we tried to get at least two each from the major housing types on site so that we could kind
Mhm.
of get a cross section of their experience, and did hour-long interviews with them asking a whole bunch of questions about the individual micro home design, but also about the larger community design, and really trying to answer the question of how well the built environment at Community First Village was serving the needs of its residents, and then
Yeah.
giving that feedback to Community First Village. And the timing of when we were doing this was when they had um, gotten the adjacent property and were making plans to expand into phase two, but hadn't put a shovel in the ground yet. So it was really perfect
Oh,
timing for
that's
us to
perfect.
go back, learn from phase one, and help share that feedback back to them to influence some of the design decisions for phase two and help them iterate on all the great work that they were doing. So for the houses, we ended up with, from all these interviews, we ended up doing some pretty robust qualitative data analysis on all of the interview
Nice.
transcripts and pulling out a bunch of different conclusions that we made specific recommendations to Community First Village on. And in the
Mhm.
houses, we had things ranging from the very functional aspects of, how well does the heating and cooling work? How well
Yeah.
does the home provide security for a resident? How well does it meet their needs in terms of, cooking and preparing food, which residents actually do in their homes much more than was originally anticipated, I think. I mean, the biggest overriding one, first of all,
Yeah.
was that the things that matter in a tiny home for a formerly chronically homeless person are the same
Mhm.
as the things that matter in your home and my home and everyone who's listening to this. The things that you
Yeah.
think are important to you are also important for someone who has recently come out of homelessness. And some of those, though, might have been missed by designers in phase one. So, a really obvious one is that a lot of the homes in phase one were not designed with very much storage. And maybe there was an
Mhm.
assumption that if someone was experiencing homelessness, they didn't have a lot of stuff. Not true. They all have a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and once they have a place to put stuff, they get more stuff, which
Yeah.
is true of all of us too. I
Of
think
all
everyone
people,
has the
I was
problem
like,
of
definitely
too
true for
much
me.
stuff in their house, trying to figure out what to do with it. And so that was a immediate lesson learned, was that the houses really needed to better accommodate storage and really think about all of the
Mhm.
different types of storage too. Another one that was a really interesting one that came out was that for the houses that had a screened porch, that screened porch was
Mhm.
providing a huge amount of benefit that was really unique to
Yeah.
those homes. And so, part of it is that once you screen in a porch, it becomes lockable, and that does give you outdoor storage space. It also seemed to change kind of the ownership and privacy, and created this intermediate space that's not the public way, but allows you to interact with it, but really claim and feel is your own. And so the screen
Mhm.
porches were really helpful in that way. And then also, a lot of the tiny homes, by nature of being tiny, are only one room. And so in the ones that had a screened porch, or there's one design in phase one that has actually a rooftop porch, and there's
Hmm.
there's one that's a dog trot that has two separate rooms. All of those ones that had more than one space were really, really
Yeah.
useful, because it allows a resident to make one space more private, one space more public, and be able to
Yeah.
control who they let in and how far they let them into their personal space. And it also
Mhm.
gave an opportunity for residents to host visitors, which was something that maybe wasn't thought about too much in design either.
Yeah.
We heard some stories even about residents who were inviting overnight guests who were currently homeless to come experience a night in Community First Village and see what it was
Aw.
like, which was a really, really amazing thing to hear about, of how they were kind of
Yeah.
paying forward what they had gotten through moving into the village and helping that for their friends who were still on the street. And so
Yeah.
it was really cool to hear which houses were able to help accommodate some of those goals as well.
Oh, that's very cool. So then what about for the larger sort of community level?
Yeah, at the community level, there are, I haven't talked yet about the community spaces that exist on site, but they do
Mhm.
have kind of a variety of different community spaces, a lot of which are focused on providing services to the residents or providing job opportunities for residents as well. And we heard a lot of
Mhm.
really great feedback about how important those job opportunities were to residents, partially
Yeah.
for income, partially for a thing to do, but also really important to the fabric of the community and building those relationships. And so, an example is one of the folks that I interviewed works in the community garden there, and they have a big
Mhm.
community garden in the center of the village, and they also have a farmers market where the produce that's grown in the garden is available free for neighbors in the village to come and access fresh
Mhm.
healthy produce. And so this neighbor who works in the garden told me about how that, his best friendships on site were with his coworkers, where he spends all day,
Mm.
working in the garden together with them, working at the farmers market. And those relationships that are built over time just through proximity and shared
Yeah.
experience were so important, and the job opportunities really, really helped with that. So that was, I think, a really great confirmation of a decision that Community First Village had made early on to provide those opportunities for residents.
I love it. You phrased it so well when you're like, we're always making a hypothesis in all of our designs, but how often do we go back and examine whether our hypothesis proved true? And I think that's why you do it. And just that is so cool. So
Well, I
cool.
learned I learned in the process part of why we don't. I remember when we first started, I said, "Why aren't architects doing this more? Why aren't we doing a better job at going back and doing this research and understanding how things worked out?" And I
Hmm.
learned in the process that the reason maybe we don't do it is that it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of
Yes,
time
it
and a lot of
does.
effort. And it's not part of our normal design services. It's not part of our normal contracts and fees. And so we don't often
Yeah.
have a good mechanism to do this work. In this case, we were able to do it with a team of volunteers. We had 10 volunteers through AIA Design Voice. That was a mix of architects from different firms and actually a few students from the UT School of Architecture as well.
Mhm.
And so we had a lot of volunteers put in a lot of volunteer hours. Um, and without that, we wouldn't have been able to do this project. So I certainly want to share credit to all of them for the great work that they did, but also acknowledge that a lot of times that's out of reach for our normal design projects. And so that's a big question I'm continuing to ask in my career is, what's the light version of that we can do more often? Or how do we convey the value to clients so that we can make that
Yeah.
part of our standard services, especially for clients who are doing repeat building
Repeat.
types and could really benefit from that research of their own buildings.
100%. What has been happening with everything that's going on right now with COVID? What have you guys learned?
Yeah, it's been really amazing to see the ways that they've adapted. And in some ways, they didn't actually have to adapt as much as many communities would because they already were set up pretty well for social distancing.
Totally.
All of the tiny homes are standalone structures that don't share air with the surrounding buildings. And so
Mhm.
and are separated by a lot of open air circulation. And so just that basic fact of the community has made it really easy for them to keep all of their residents safe. And then
That's
even
awesome.
some of their bigger community spaces, their biggest main gathering space is called Unity Hall, and it's a building that's central within the community that has a big multi-purpose room space that kind of serves as their sanctuary, also a big community gathering room. They do different events and markets and things in that space. And that space has giant roll up doors, is connected to a breezeway with a
Mhm.
huge fan. And so a lot of their spaces, I think, already have a lot of indoor outdoor connection and great air circulation. And that was
Mhm.
part of their community from day one. Um,
Yeah.
Probably for multiple reasons. One, it's cheaper to you take advantage
Yeah.
of the outdoor space than it is to put it
Yeah.
all inside. Two, they have residents who historically have spent a lot of time outside and might not always be comfortable immediately feeling closed in and like they don't have an out. And so that's something they're really sensitive to in design is kind of creating layers of how far people choose to step in and letting there
Yeah.
be ways to kind of sidle up without having to fully be engaged and letting residents choose exactly how engaged to be. And so the design supports that.
Yeah.
And then they have, during COVID, they've installed stations throughout the village where they've installed extra hand washing stations because, as mentioned, not all the houses have plumbing. They have shared bathroom facilities. And so, in order to have more frequent places to wash hands, they put extra kind of sanitation stations throughout the village. They also really shut down visitor access to the site really early. So a lot of their volunteer activities and tours and all of the ways they had been inviting other people onto the site, they've really, really limited that during COVID so that people are really only going to the site if they have a very good reason to be there. And they
Mhm.
actually employed some residents to be kind of they set up this tent at the front where they've got the gates closed and anyone that pulls up, they talk to them and find out if they need to be there or not. So that created a new job opportunity that actually has become a social
Nice.
space as well. There's always several people hanging out there in the security tent. And last
Wow.
I heard, they have had 0 COVID cases the entire time.
That is wonderful. So one of the things I was wondering is, as you've interviewed these people, are there any sort of personal stories of residents or their experiences that you can share with our listeners to be able to help to like picture life in Community First Village?
There was one woman that I spoke with, and she had been homeless, had been sort of estranged from her family. And one of the things that when I interviewed her and heard about her experience, the thing that really came up again and again was the way that she has found family at Community First Village, and that includes,
Mhm.
with Alan and Trisha Graham, who are kind of the founders, who she almost would speak about as like parent figures now that they've
Oh,
really adopted her, and she has this kind of boundless trust in them and that they will help look out for her and take care of her. But also that sort of this forged family that they've made on site with all of these relationships between individuals. And, this woman that I spoke to, I think I asked her a little bit naively how long she planned to stay at Community First Village. And, and she looked me straight in the eyes and said, like, I will live here until I die. Like I'm not going
Yeah.
anywhere else. Like she said, if Alan and Trisha leave, maybe I'll go with them. But like otherwise, I'm here. This is my community. This is my home. And that's something that I think
Mm,
is really, really beautiful and really wonderful that they've set up the community in this way where it's not viewed as transitional housing. It's not supposed to be a stepping stone to help people get back on their feet and get into some other quote unquote normal living situation.
yeah.
Like this is the community that people want to be in and want to stay in. Really amazing to see. I think it's something that a lot of us wish we had in our communities and our neighborhoods. I certainly don't have the same quality of relationships with my neighbors that I see that people at Community First Village have.
I was thinking the same thing as what a precious, wonderful gift that is of, community and of connection that don't we all wish that we could emulate that in our own lives and in our own communities? So I just wanted to take a moment and sort of see if there's anything else that I know that you're involved in a whole lot of other things, and if there's something else that you think is, really important to mention.
A couple of years ago, worked with some other folks here in Austin to start a leadership program for architects in Austin that's
Hmm.
explicitly focused on increasing equity and leadership in our profession. And this grew out of a lot of conversations that we were having years ago around a women in architecture exhibit that came to Austin. And one of the organizers of that exhibit challenged me with the question of, hey, if we raise a bunch of money for this exhibit, what should we do with it to help
I
women
love
in
it.
architecture in Austin? And that sent us down this whole road and a lot of really great conversations. And the thing that we really saw was the gap that women experience between going to architecture school, getting licensed, and that really there's a big drop off when you look at advancement to who is leading firms, who's winning design awards, who's getting the recognition and the promotion to
Mhm.
really help lead the work that we all as designers are doing. And
Yeah.
how can we help create more diverse leadership in our profession? And really, that's in service of a bigger goal, which is as designers, we're shaping the built environment that affects our entire community. And when we do that with a group of people who don't represent our entire community, we're probably missing a lot of opportunities and ways that the design could serve those people the best. And so, to me, that's
Man.
kind of part and parcel of the bigger conversation about how do we take everything that we're doing and do it really well and
Yeah.
do it in a way that does service to the people that it's serving and that justifies all of the resources that got put into it. And
Yeah.
I think it's hard to do that without diversifying our leadership. And so that program has been our effort to start or help work on that here in Austin. And it's just finished its third year. We just accepted the class for next year's group, which will be the fourth year. So it's been
Awesome.
amazing to watch many, many people go through that program and then watch them become more involved as leaders in their firms, as leaders in our local AIA chapter. So I think we're just starting to see the fruits of our labor on that, and hopefully we'll continue to see it for many years.
A lot of the leadership programs that I hear about are really kind of around maximizing that single individual's, like, okay, how do you project manage, or how do we, do business development, or, financing, and all of that's really important, but like what you're talking about is how do we help to create the leaders that can lead the way for transformational change. And I think when you said high quality, better design, and I think that, like, in your statement it's sort of implied, but I think that it's important to say yes, and that what that means is human centered and equitable and in service of the greater, human condition, not um, solely that it is aesthetically pleasing, although, of course, that's important.
We're not building buildings just to look at them. We're not building buildings just to show how creative we can be. We're building buildings to solve a problem and to serve a need. And that need is generally for the people who are going to experience those buildings. And so the more that we can engage with and understand and really dig into what those needs are and make sure that the building serves it, the better. All of us moving forward need to be thinking about in all of our designs, what are the social impacts? What are the environmental impacts? And how do we get more and more of the good and less of the bad?
If there's something that you wish more people knew around designing for social connection and social health in the built environment, like what do you wish people would use to inform their design decisions?
I think the biggest thing is, being a really good listener, being a good observer of the world around you and the ways that people are interacting. Every design is hopefully building on the body of knowledge that we already have as designers, and hopefully allows us to get better and better at those things. But I think it's naive to think that any one building or any one designer is going to solve that and come up with the perfect answer to any question. And
Mhm.
so, I think it's all about communication and checking in on those things and really clearly articulating what the goals are, and being able to talk to everybody involved to make sure that those goals are met.
All right. Well, Shelby, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your time and your story and the story of Community First Village with us. It has been such a joy to talk with you, and I really appreciate everything. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Shared Space. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a minute to subscribe wherever you're listening and head on over to Apple to give us a review. It really helps to spread the word, and we really appreciate it. I hope that your day is filled with honest emotion, kindness, and connection. Thanks so much, and take care.